Hi, I'm Matt Culkin, co-chair of Steptoe's Financial Services Group, and welcome to the next session of Steptoe's Financial Services University. We're pleased to present a series of short, focused conversations with my colleagues from across the firm's various practice groups and offices around the world. Through Steptoe U, we will explore key issues and topics that impact businesses in the financial services arena. Our courses cover a wide array of issues: tax, trade, sanctions, government investigations, commercial litigation, and much more. Please visit the course offerings to learn about these options. And please check back regularly to see what courses we've added. Today we're going to explore the world of corporate governance and boards of directors. I'm pleased to be joined by Michael Dockterman, an experienced commercial trial lawyer who's litigated cases around the world. But today we're going to focus on Michael's experience counseling boards of directors on a wide range of corporate governance matters. He has a broad array of experience in CEO evaluation, board self-assessment, committee function and structure, and facilitating strategic planning within the roles appropriate to management and board members. And Michael has lectured frequently on governance matters at the Kellogg School of Business. Michael, thank you for joining me today.
It's my pleasure, Matt. Very happy to be here.
To start, companies come in all shapes and sizes: public, private, closely held, outside investors. So let's start with a public company board of directors. What's their primary responsibility? And is there any sort of baseline commonality for all public company directors? And if so, how would you describe that?
If you're a public company, you're listed somewhere. And so if you're listed on the New York Exchange, you abide by the rules of the New York Exchange. If you're listed on the NASDAQ, you abide by the rules of the NASDAQ. All of those are presented and approved by the SEC. So from a legal baseline, if you're a public company, there are certain things that you must do. And that used to be different. All corporations were creatures of, almost all corporations were creatures of state law, and their governance processes were really controlled by state law. That's changed really in this millennium, because with the passage of first Sarbanes-Oxley and then Dodd-Frank, you have much more federal regulation of the way in which corporations conduct themselves. There are a couple of common themes, one of which is that if you're a director, your duty is to the shareholders of the corporation. And we used to say until fairly recently, your only duty was to the shareholders of the corporation. In recent years, that's expanded to include other stakeholders of the corporation. The definition of those who have an interest has changed in the 50 years since Milton Friedman published his essay. It's really 50 years ago this month, what the duty is for all corporations, and therefore the shareholder representatives, that is the board members, who oversee management at those corporations. Sorry, that's probably a longer answer than you were looking for, but that's what's in common.
And if you had to sort of do a compare and contrast with private companies, is there any sort of hallmark distinction just right out of the gate?
Well, many private companies don't have independent directors. Every public company today really does have independent directors, and those independent directors for listed companies fill a number of very important roles in compensation and in risk and in audit. But in a privately held company, you don't have those same requirements by law. Some states are more stringent than others. More corporations tend to govern themselves by the laws of Delaware or New York or under the Model Business Corporation Act. And in all of those, if you are a director of a privately held company, your duty really is only to the shareholders, and it's usually a very small number of shareholders. It's not a bad analogy to think about the people who are running the corporation as similar to those who run a partnership. You owe a duty to your other partners, but your principal duty is to the institution, being mindful all the time of what your partners really want. In a closely held corporation, that's really the way it works.
And of course, that can change depending on who your quote unquote partners are. That'll depend on who owns the company and if you have outside investors or if it's closely held.
and who sits on the company. You know, your bylaws and your charter will have something to do with that as well. Sometimes you have designated slots on the board. There's an interesting legal question as to whether a designated representative on the board owes a duty to the entity or the person who put that director on the board, or whether it's owed to all owners in the same way. The better view is that it's owed to all owners in the same way, and then you get to some interesting questions about confidentiality and what can or can't be reported. That also happens, by the way, in public companies. For example, if you have a significant investment by a union, yeah, and there are two representatives sitting on that board, what do those two folks tell the union members as opposed to the other confidentiality obligations binding everybody else? Those are small points of tension. They're usually resolved pretty quickly. And I don't want to go down a rabbit hole on any particular thing, but those are good examples, Matt, of the way in which if you're sitting on a board, you have a general duty to everybody, and those are the duties of care and loyalty, but you also have specific duties to the people who have put you there. You need to balance the two of those.
So let's talk for a minute about when parties challenge a decision that the board makes, whether that's a shareholder suit, or even if a government regulatory body comes in and starts to look at the decisions that a board has made, or even how they've gone about making the decision. You know, are there bright lines, or is there clear guidance that boards can look to when they're trying to assess how to meet their obligations?
Again, your duties are fiduciary duties of loyalty and care. And there are standards for loyalty and care in each of the states which are required of people who sit on boards. In addition, if you are publicly traded, you have to abide by the Sarbanes-Oxley rules, you have to abide by the Dodd-Frank rules, you have to abide by the rules of your SRO. A long list. There's another overlay, and it's a federal overlay, and that is the federal sentencing guideline, because a corporation itself can be subject to criminal prosecution. Chapter 8 of the sentencing guidelines deals directly with how the government will look at the role of a director and management. Let me try to encapsulate it this way. Management and the board each have their own role. Management runs the company, the board oversees the company. In order to be able to do that, the board needs timely information about all of the material acts, events, and conditions of the company. The only way a board can do that is to have avenues for that information to get there. You can't really evaluate the information until you have it all, but you can evaluate the quality of the avenues. So the first step, and this is really from case law in the mid-1990s, is that you want to make sure that the flow of information about material acts, events, and conditions within the corporation comes to you as a director in a timely manner to allow you to fulfill your duty of care. And when you fulfill your duty of care, you must be loyal to the corporation, not to yourself, not to any specific group of shareholders, but to all of the shareholders and key stakeholders for the corporation.
Well, so that sort of raises the next question. You know, during an enforcement proceeding, or if you're brought in to conduct an internal investigation, it's usually with the benefit of doing that review with hindsight to your advantage. And particularly this, I would imagine this is true more so in the financial services space, where you have either banking or securities regulatory laws that are put on top of the corporate governance laws that you were talking about. So I'm curious, when you do go in and look around, or if a regulatory body goes in to assess a board's decision-making process, what do they look at, and are there sort of obvious instances where companies haven't met the threshold?
There are very few instances where board members, as board members, are found not to have met that threshold. Let's take away the merger context, because there's a lot of case law that's developed over the years. And you can imagine people sitting on boards, some have alliances with the offeror, some have alliances with entrenched management. So let's kind of set that aside because that's an unusual circumstance and talk about the day-to-day oversight of the corporation. If you're in the financial services world, you're dealing not only with the things that I just described, but also with the OCC, which is going to come in regularly and ask questions about the avenues of communication. They will look primarily at internal audit. And remember, under the current federal regulatory scheme, you have both audit and risk that are evaluated by the OCC, because it's the creation of the risk committees that's really the new piece for financial services companies. But both of those employ internal audit or some form of internal audit to evaluate not only the issues, but the processes. And OCC comes in and looks at those processes. And then they look at things that have occurred in the preceding quarter or half year or year, and they look to see what you've done about them. There's a dialogue back and forth with the OCC. Think about that in a more criminal context. There's going to be a dialogue back and forth with folks who are doing the enforcement, either from the SEC or from Department of Justice, or state regulatory bodies. If you're in the insurance world, you have to deal with insurance commissioners in each of the states as well. There's a lot to worry about if you're a director. And one of the things that can happen if you're a director is you spend all your time checking the boxes. You spend all your time looking at all the things that you're supposed to look at. And that means it's hard to find the time to do the things the director really wants to do, and that's engage with management so that she can understand what's really going on, what are the risks, and what are we doing with them. We want to be looking at the risks that we're going to face next year. We learn about what we did with the risks last year in order to inform ourselves on that, but you really aren't going to dwell, or you shouldn't be dwelling, on what happened before and only on what happened before. You look at that to learn about how to protect what's going to happen in the future. Those are the risks against which you want to guard.
Yeah, so I want to shift gears a little bit, Michael. You've talked about the OCC, you've talked about the SEC, the Department of Justice. What's happening at the state and the federal level to push for more diversity and inclusion on corporate boards right now?
Different states are pushing in different ways, mostly unsuccessfully. Abroad, there have been legislative solutions, primarily in Europe, but also in Australia and in Singapore, to the number of women who have to be on a board, what the minority representation has to be on a board. And in California, for example, they've tried to legislate the number of different people who can be on a board. That's different from state to state, and it's largely been ineffective. There's a recent study that suggests that although 40% of the population of people who own shares in American corporations are what we would traditionally call from minority groups, only 12 or 12.5% of the board members come from that same population. That's up from 10% about 5 years ago, but it's not nearly close enough, which is one of the reasons why you see a push for more diversity and inclusion of all different kinds coming from states. You have not seen it from the more traditional states yet, but that may very well be coming too. The principal push comes from independent institutional investors who, through 2 or 3 organizations, have been quite active in saying, we're not going to vote for boards that don't reflect the constituency of people who are the owners here or who are the stakeholders in this company.
And where do you see that going in the next 5 or 10 years?
It's not going to abate. It's going to continue. It's going to continue for a couple of reasons. One, we're going to age out. The dinosaurs who have perpetuated the way in which we learned about corporate law in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, we're all going to retire. And the people who will take board positions and become academics in this area, they will have grown up in a much more inclusive environment. And so they'll look harder at this and they'll push harder at this. And there'll be more data provided as to the benefits that come from this. For a long time, we debated, is it good to have independent directors? Do companies with more independent directors do better financially than companies that have inside directors? And it's taken a long time to kind of draw the data out, but it's generally accepted today that independent directors are a value add rather than anything else. You're going to see more data like that. It's being gathered at the good universities today, and people will be able to use that, as you say, over the next 5 or 10 years to push with data for more diversity and inclusion on boards.
Well, before we let you go, I want to ask one more question that may be applicable to our audience, particularly the lawyers who frequently get asked to serve on different boards. What's your advice to them in terms of what they need to know or what they should ask before they say yes?
Well, the first thing you need to know is it takes a lot of time. Many people have been asked to serve on not-for-profit boards, community organizations, and you know how much time that takes. You're going to increase that amount of time if you're going to go on either a privately held but commercial venture board, certainly on a public company board. I mean, you're talking about spending hundreds of hours a year to do this. And you need to learn the company. It's an odd construct that the people who oversee companies, because they tend to be independent, they're non-management, they have to be disinterested if they're going to make and validate decisions. You're asking them to make decisions that may countermand the things that are proposed by people who live and breathe that corporation every single day. So you need to know the context and you need to know the culture, which means you have to be a good journalist, you have to be a good reporter, you have to ask the who, what, where, when, why, and how questions about everything. You have to look hard but not accept at face value what you've received. You ask the tough questions not just to the CEO, but you ask the tough questions to the people at the head of each of the verticals in the company. And then you dig down below them to make sure that you understand what really is going on, why it's going on, what the risks are associated with it, and how the company is planning to deal with those risks.
That's great. Thank you. And Michael, thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Matt. I'm glad we're doing this.
So that does it for this episode of Steptoe U, where we dove into issues related to corporate governance. You can watch more of our Financial Services University videos and get more information about our financial services practice at steptoe.com. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.